On October 2, 1944, in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a transport truck rattled up the gravel path to the gates of Camp Ashford. Inside, 27 young German women, all recently captured auxiliary Luftwaffe personnel, sat rigidly on worn wooden benches, surrounded by armed American guards. They had been told nothing, only that they were being taken west, far from the scorched edges of the European front. Their eyes, under heavy brows and fraying caps, scanned the pine-tipped mountains for signs of wire fences or punishment blocks. Some whispered about beatings, about dogs, about starvation. They all expected cold floors and hard labor. Instead, as the gates creaked open, one of the guards turned and muttered something that froze them mid-breath. Hot showers inside. The words seemed unreal, misplaced, half-believed. Their boots touched American soil as prisoners, their minds still chained to images of vengeance. But beyond that gate, something unexpected waited. Their first step into Camp Ashford felt nothing like captivity. No barking sergeant, no sirens, no snarled orders in a tongue they didn't understand. Instead, there was a silence broken only by the crunch of gravel under boots and the soft rustle of Appalachian wind through the trees. The guard who had spoken glanced back once, his jaw tight, but his eyes unreadable. A second later, a woman in civilian dress appeared by the mess hall doors, short gray hair, spectacles, blouse tucked neatly into a wool skirt. She smiled. The POWs hesitated, glancing at one another for confirmation that she was real. "You'll be assigned quarters after hygiene," she said in clipped English, then motioned toward the wooden buildings to the left. The group moved slowly, bewildered. Inside, steam curled from open shower stalls, and piles of crisp white towels sat folded on benches. One of them, a 19-year-old named Liesel, reached out and trembled. "They want to soften us," she whispered, half to herself, "before they break us." The water ran warm over pale, shivering skin, and for a moment, none of them spoke. Some cried quiet, stunned tears sliding down cheeks that hadn't felt soap in weeks. Liesel lathered the milled American bar between her fingers, inhaling a faint scent of lavender. It felt like theft, like a trick of war. Across from her, Ingrid, the eldest among them, pressed her forehead to the cold tile and whispered a prayer, though to which God, even she didn't know. There was an emptiness inside each girl, a place where hunger, fear, and silence had once nested. Now it was being filled with something stranger than safety disbelief. As white linens replaced their stiff Luftwaffe coats, they held the fabric gingerly, like it might vanish at any second. "Is this a game?" someone asked. No one answered. Outside, in a country not yet broken by warplanes, the sun dragged long shadows across neatly raked gravel. At dinner they were served beef stew, cornbread, and iced tea. Not rations, not powdered soup or stale biscuits, but real food, warm and rich-smelling, ladled onto ceramic plates by women in aprons, who addressed them not as prisoners but as guests. The dining hall buzzed in quiet disbelief. Forks clinked, eyes darted over shoulders. No one spoke above a whisper. Liesel sat beside Ingrid, who stared down at her bowl without lifting the spoon. "This is American," Ingrid muttered, her voice brittle. "They want something from us." 2 bunks down, a girl choked on a sob with her mouth still full, suspicion tangled with shame. How could comfort feel so punishing? How could kindness tighten the chest more than cruelty? A soldier near the doorway watched in silence, fingers tapping the butt of a rifle. Not a jailer, not a savior, just a man, in a country they didn't understand, watching ghosts try to remember they were still human. Night sank slowly over Camp Ashford, casting the forested hills in deep blue and black. Inside Barrack B, the women lay in narrow beds with mattresses softer than any they'd known in months. Some stared at the wooden beams above. Others clutched the blankets with a quiet desperation, like they might be snatched away at dawn. Silence pressed down again, not the oppressive quiet of fear, but something eerier, the calm after expectation unfulfilled. No interrogations, no forced labor, just stillness. Liesel turned over, her thoughts swimming. Back in Europe, surrender had felt like the collapse of everything. But here, the collapse came in quieter ways. Pillows, warmth, a lullaby of crickets outside. She thought of the prisoner trains, of hunger pressing bone against skin, of the dead-eyed stare of Allied medics, and now, cotton sheets. She didn't trust it, neither did the others, but sleep came anyway, thick and dreamless, as if pulled from a world they no longer belonged to. Morning arrived not with reveille, but with the smell of coffee and fried eggs curling through the slats in the barracks walls. Liesel sat up slowly, disoriented. The light was golden, soft. Someone had left a uniform jacket draped over a chair, its Luftwaffe insignia so out of place it looked like a costume in a theater. Outside, the camp's routine had begun: sweeping, sorting, quiet conversations in broken English between guards and prisoners. A Red Cross nurse passed by, waving gently, and one of the American guards offered a cigarette to a girl named Marta, who hesitated only a moment before accepting. There was no screaming, no barking orders, just gestures, civility, human routines. "It can't last," Ingrid said, brushing her hair with her fingers. Liesel didn't answer. How could she? The war still raged on half a world away. But inside these wire fences, the laws of pain seemed temporarily suspended, and it only made the silence louder. Mid-morning brought the first letter, a small envelope, cream-colored and neatly typed, handed to Liesel by a brown-eyed orderly with a southern drawl. She hesitated before touching it, searching his face for sarcasm, trickery, anything. But the man simply nodded and stepped away. Her name was spelled almost correctly, from a cousin in Dresden. The contents were brief, cautious, examined later under the barracks weak bulb: a few lines about weather and ration cards, about how the bombing had stopped, for now. The words felt both distant and dangerous, folded like contraband. Around her, other women began receiving their own ghosts from across the ocean. Letters, names, loss wrapped in brittle paper. The effect was quiet but seismic. One girl read hers twice, then set it on her lap and murmured, "My brother is dead." She said it evenly, like reciting a line from vocabulary drills. No one responded. Outside, the American flag whipped gently in the breeze, as if trying not to intrude. In the weeks that followed, routine settled, but trust remained elusive. Every polite word from a guard, every steaming plate of food, every clean sheet was met with side glances, with the unspoken fear that this comfort was a prologue to something worse. Yet nothing came. There were English classes, choir rehearsals, even sketches drawn in charcoal by a girl named Clara, who once studied sculpture in Hamburg. Camp Ashford, impossibly, felt like a holding place not for punishment, but for pause. The real war remained elsewhere, like a fevered dream unshared. Still, the women flinched when shadows moved too fast, still hesitated before laughter. Some wrote long letters they never mailed, some stopped counting the days. One afternoon, Liesel sat beneath a sycamore tree, watching orange leaves drift to the dirt. Her hands were clean, her stomach full. And yet, in that moment, she felt the most imprisoned, because freedom tasted unfamiliar, and peace sounded like silence, waiting to be shattered. The first real fracture came with the arrival of a new group, male POWs from Afrika Korps, sunburnt and stone-faced, marched into the compound under separate guard. The women were ordered to remain in their quarters, blinds drawn, conversations hushed. That night, laughter echoed softly from the men's side of camp, harsh, defiant, perhaps drunk with the same disbelief. It unsettled Liesel. She crept to the window and peered out through a sliver in the curtain. One man stood smoking beneath a floodlight, his silhouette relaxed, like a soldier on break, not a prisoner. Beside her, Ingrid murmured, "They're pretending it's not war." There was envy in her voice, or maybe fear. For all their quiet and routine, the illusion of calm had never fully healed the rupture inside. Now, with others present, the illusion thinned further. It became clearer each day. This strange kindness was not a promise. It was a pause. And pauses do not last forever. Weeks brewed tension in silence. Then one evening, a rumor slipped through camp like smoke: interrogators were coming. Not guards, not nurses, but men in suits, speaking perfect German, carrying folders thicker than the girls' barracks mattresses. By morning, it was confirmed. The Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, had assigned specialists to debrief selected prisoners for intelligence, particularly those with roles in signal work or command support. Liesel's name was on the list. Her hands trembled as she dressed, buttoning her shirt with fingers gone suddenly numb. The interview room looked nothing like she expected. No blinding lamp, no chains, just a desk, 2 chairs, and coffee already poured. The man across from her was around 50, with soft eyes and a scar tucked into the crease of his jaw. He asked about keyboards, encryption command structures, radar logs. Then he asked about her brother. She had never said she had one. The room went cold. Outside, the cicadas kept singing. Liesel barely blinked. A beat passed before the pulse returned to her ears. "I don't understand," she said quietly, though she did. The man didn't press. He only smiled faintly, closed his folder, and thanked her for her time. It was a kindness more terrifying than accusation. That night, Liesel sat on her bunk staring at nothing, her arms wrapped tight around her knees. She told no one what had been asked, nor what had not. Around her others came back from identical interviews with odd expressions, some guarded, others blank. The questions varied, never cruel, but always precise. It wasn't violence they feared now, but being seen too clearly. The guards still passed out chocolate on Sundays. The heaters still hummed to life before dusk. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The camp, once a purgatory of confusing kindness, had shifted into something else, a mirror, and every day the women stared deeper into it, uncertain of what stared back. By mid-December, snow had dusted Camp Ashford into stillness. The pine branches bent under white weight, and footprints marked quiet paths between the mess hall and barracks. Christmas neared. For many of the women, it was the first time in years they'd thought of it without sirens or shivers. A makeshift tree was erected in the corner of the rec building, pine cones, scrap fabric, foil stars pressed from cigarette wrappers. It was absurd and sacred all at once. They sang carols in German, soft and breathy, attempting joy the way one learns to speak a foreign tongue. That night, Liesel received a small parcel, a knitted scarf in cornflower blue, with no return address. She unfolded it like it held breath, tears stinging her eyes before she could stop them. Across the camp, candles flickered in bunker windows, shadows dancing over the snow. It was a tableau out of memory, but nothing felt familiar. War had taken so much, even the feeling of coming home. The new year passed quietly. Snow thawed into brown slush, and winter's grip eased from the hills surrounding Camp Ashford. Yet a shift had occurred, hard to name but impossible to ignore. The songs had faded. The letters grew shorter. Conversations dulled. News from Europe arrived on delayed currents. Dresden burning, Berlin encircled, silence from the Eastern Front. Some women counted days again. Others packed their few belongings on instinct alone. One morning, a list was posted. Repatriation. Liesel's name was not on it. Ingrid's was. They hugged stiffly, wordlessly. No promises, no illusions. Just the knowledge that whatever this strange pause had been, it was ending. A week later, military trucks carried half the camp east. The bunk beds stood half empty, the towels still white. Liesel wandered to the fence and looked beyond it. She realized she'd forgotten how far America stretched. After everything, the strangest truth lingered. Captivity had spared her something that freedom might not. Spring arrived without celebration. Trees budded along the ridgelines, and the birds returned, calling to one another like nothing had changed. But inside Camp Ashford, the air held a tension just beneath its warmth. More lists, more trucks. The process of return had begun, piece by quiet piece. Liesel had not spoken much since Ingrid left. She spent her days scrubbing already clean plates in the mess hall, watching reflections ripple in the soapy water. Then one morning she was summoned, not for questioning, not for punishment, but for departure. Her name at last was called. Hours later, she stood at the gate with a cardboard suitcase and the cornflower scarf knotted around her neck. The guard at the gate offered her a cigarette. She declined. When the truck rolled forward, she didn't look back. Past the forests, past the gravel, past the silence, waited a world she no longer fit into. And as America disappeared behind the bend, so did whatever part of her had dared to feel safe in its paradox of mercy. Years later, when the war had become a chapter in textbooks and the silence of Camp Ashford had long since dissolved into memory, Liesel found herself standing in a quiet Berlin museum. The exhibit bore the name Echoes of Captivity and displayed artifacts from the American internment camps, barbed wire segments, photos of smiling guards, even a folded white towel under glass. She stood motionless before it. Around her, whispers floated in German and English, unaware of the woman whose hands had once grasped that very linen in disbelief. A curator passed and mentioned how some POWs were treated unusually well. Liesel didn't respond. What words could ever explain the slow unraveling of fear, the terrifying gentleness that had haunted her more than any wound? The war had ended, yes, the world had moved on, but in her the contradiction still lived, that even in the midst of blood and burning, someone had given her soap, warmth, and the choice to trust or withhold. She stepped away, the echoes following her, as quiet and persistent as snow on pine. Outside the museum, Berlin's streets pulsed with life children chasing pigeons, trams clicking past old stone facades, laughter stitched into the air like thread on an open wound. But Liesel felt apart from it all. She paused beside a newsstand, watching headlines about new alliances, digital futures, peacetime victories. The world had rebranded itself, erased the edges, yet within her, the past was still awake. Not just the hunger or the fear, but the dissonance, the absurd, aching memory of lavender soap, metal forks, and rooms without screams. She had never spoken publicly about Camp Ashford. It remained hers alone, not a secret, but a scar without a name. Some nights, she still dreamed of the Appalachians and woke with the phantom smell of pine and stew clinging to her pillow. Others might remember battles and glory. She remembered kindness as a weapon more powerful than any rifle. And in the end, it was that mercy, not the war, that refused to be forgotten. The ghosts of Camp Ashford never quite faded. Decades later, long after Liesel's reflection no longer matched her memories, she returned one last time. The camp was gone now, reclaimed by grass and ash and silence. Only the foundations remained, half buried beneath moss and wildflower. She moved slowly through the field, her cane touching old gravel in rhythm, her scarf faded but still tied close. There was no signpost, no marker, only the wind passing between trees like an old voice remembered but forgotten. She stood where the showers once steamed, where folded towels once lay untouched. Nothing was there, yet everything returned. The fear, the confusion, the warmth. She lowered herself onto a stump and closed her eyes. Even now, she could not say whether Camp Ashford had imprisoned her or saved her. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But in that quiet, with the world peeled away, she realized something simple and terrible. Forgiveness needs form, and sometimes it's shaped like a clean towel. As dusk settled over the empty field where Camp Ashford once stood, Liesel remained seated not as an old woman drawn by nostalgia, but as someone finally setting something down. The years had blurred faces, warped voices, softened betrayals, but the feeling from that first hot shower, the disbelief, the fear, the fragile bloom of hope still lingered sharp-edged in her chest. War had taken, but it had also inverted the expected, showing her that cruelty doesn't always wear a uniform, and sometimes mercy does. As the sky turned violet above the hills, she whispered a name not her own and pressed her palm to the earth. Perhaps it was an apology. Perhaps it was a thank you. No one heard. No one needed to. In the hush of the Appalachian evening, with no guards, no fences, no songs, the memory of Camp Ashford folded itself back into silence. And with it, Liesel finally rose, whole in ways only the broken understand. Years peeled away like layers of snow, but Camp Ashford remained a presence in the folds of veteran archives and whispered family stories. In 1992, a documentary researcher uncovered forgotten military records detailing the unusual treatment of certain German POWs, especially women. Among the stacks of faded paperwork was a roster marked October 2nd, 1944. Liesel's name was there, circled in red pencil. The image appeared briefly in a public broadcast, and for a moment, the world peered into the gap between cruelty and compassion, but it was fleeting. For every file rediscovered, hundreds remained wrapped in dust and silence. Somewhere, though, in a drawer or beneath a floorboard, A bar of unused lavender soap might still rest, its scent dulled, its shape unbroken, a quiet relic of a war that offered not just destruction, but dissonance. Because the real legacy of Camp Ashford wasn't the structure, the fences, or the reports. It was the unbearable idea that even in captivity, they were given dignity. And that dignity, unexpected, undeserved, unforgettable, would stir in memory long after flags had been folded and silence restored. No monuments stand at the site of Camp Ashford, no plaques bear witness to what unfolded there. The forest took it back inch by inch, year by year, until only stories remained brittle, contested, nearly lost. But somewhere deep in the earth, beneath layers of moss and time, the footprints endure. Of young women who entered as enemies and were received with quiet contradiction. Of nights not filled with screams, but with silence so profound it echoed louder than violence. Liesel never wrote memoirs. She never gave interviews. But in her final days, she asked to be buried with a towel. White, folded, scented faintly with lavender. It made no sense to the young nurse who packed her belongings until she found a yellowed envelope tucked beneath the scarf. Inside, one sentence, written in delicate German script. Sometimes, mercy leaves the deepest bruise. And perhaps that was all the history she needed to leave behind. So the story of Camp Ashford ends not in glory or condemnation, but in tension, a riddle buried beneath civility. It resists clear judgment. It traps memory in paradox. The women who passed through its gates carried its mark, not as wounds, but as questions. What does it mean to be cared for by one's enemy? Can kindness cleanse trauma, or only coat it in confusion? Generations since have sought to categorize such places as anomalies, as propaganda, as footnotes. But Liesel knew better. The towel folded on her chest was not just fabric, it was testimony. That in one corner of a burning world, cruelty yielded to something else. Not absolution, not redemption, but the quiet, unspoken offering of humanity, the kind that does not ask to be remembered, but refuses, in its stillness, to ever be erased. And so, Camp Ashford vanishes into the folds of unreconciled history, not heroic, not cruel, just a place that unsettled the rules. In films and textbooks, it's barely a line, yet in the chambers of those who lived it, it remains a chapter with no last page. The war demanded hatred, demanded violence, yet here, woven into steam and linens and voices that spoke softly across fences, there was something else, not peace, not freedom, but the chance, for a heartbeat, to be seen. And that perhaps is what lingers most, that in a time built on division, a moment of gentleness survived. The mountains still stand, the wind still moves through the trees. Somewhere in West Virginia, beneath grass and time, silence still hums like it did on that October morning. And if you listen closely, perhaps it says what Liesel never could out loud. Captivity showed her how to survive, but kindness showed her how to live. There will never be a shrine, no formal day of remembrance for the women of Camp Ashford. Their names, scattered in ledgers and fading letters, are too obscure, their story too quiet. Yet in some attic box or cemetery ledger, their traces remain simple, unglorified, but indelible. A photograph with soft edges, a scarf that smells faintly of lavender decades after being packed away, a letter signed with trembling hands from a place no longer marked on maps. It is there, in the still corners of personal memory, that Camp Ashford endures, not in parades or speeches, but in the hollow between horror and grace. What happened there was not heroism, and it was never fully sanctuary, but it was something stubbornly human. As time folds back on itself, and the world writes new wars, new captives, perhaps somewhere a girl will hear silence where cruelty was supposed to be, and remember, even in the cruelest designs, mercy sometimes slips through, like light, through an unlocked door. No war record, no victory speech, no ceasefire agreement ever accounted for what happened inside those wooden walls. Camp Ashford was not a test of might, but of soul, a quiet theater where people expected cruelty and received contradiction instead. And contradiction, when prolonged, becomes memory's sharpest thorn. Liesel once wrote a line in an unsigned letter, never sent, left between the pages of an old hymn book. I waited for pain, and pain never came, and that waiting became its own wound. Somewhere, perhaps, a historian might still find it, misfiled, misunderstood, dismissed, but that sentence carried the weight of every folded towel, every untouched scream, every soft-spoken command. The story does not end with fences falling or names reclaimed. It ends with silence, and a scent, and a ghost of compassion that should not have been but was. That was Camp Ashford's greatest defiance, not that it existed, but that it was never supposed to. And so, the story closes not with resolution, but with resonance. Camp Ashford was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to be efficient, invisible, procedural, a temporary holding ground for enemy bodies. But instead, it etched itself into the unspoken corridors of those who passed through it, precisely because it did what no one expected. It withheld pain. It offered hands instead of fists. It showed a version of humanity, not erased by uniform or allegiance. The women who emerged from its gates did not carry medals, but they bore witness to something subtler, the possibility that in the machinery of war, a gear might catch, and in that pause, empathy could bloom quietly, unnervingly, without reason. That is why decades later, with histories rewritten and voices faded, the memory still stirs, not loudly, not clearly, but persistently, like footsteps through unmarked snow. Not everyone will hear it, but for those who do, Camp Ashford will never quite disappear. Camp Ashford's legacy does not scream, it does not march, it does not demand acknowledgement. It survives instead in the quiet breath between facts and feelings, suspended in the memories of women who were once taught to expect savagery, but instead encountered the haunting weight of mercy. This script began with boots on gravel and ends with footprints fading into moss. No names etched in stone, no registry of absolution, just a towel, a scarf, a silence so thick it still echoes. The camp gave nothing definitive, only questions that time has not answered. What does it mean when gentleness becomes a form of disorientation? When the absence of brutality feels like another kind of trial? The world moved on, history categorized. But in some corner of collective memory, Camp Ashford remains, unchanged by classification, a fracture in logic, a whisper that disobeyed the war. And perhaps that is all history truly needs to remember, the moments that refuse to behave like the rest. Still, even now, the question persists. Why did it happen that way? Historians have speculated, officers have downplayed, and survivors have mostly remained silent. But maybe there was no grand strategy, no orchestrated plan of mercy. Maybe it was just people, individuals on either side of a war zone choosing, consciously or not, to let basic decency slip through the cracks of duty. The hot showers, the clean towels, the lavender-scented soap, they were not weapons nor rewards. They were anomalies. And in a world wound tight with cruelty, anomalies matter. Camp Ashford stands not as a symbol of virtue, but of possibility, a flicker in the darkness where some chose differently, even when they didn't have to. And though the gate rusted, the documents faded, and the silence thickened with time, the question remains suspended in that gap. What happens when mercy is offered not because it is earned, but simply because someone chooses to give it? So ends the story of Camp Ashford, not with full understanding, but with an unsettled echo. It was never a triumph, never an indictment, just a fault line in the expected path of war. A place where cruelty was anticipated and never arrived, leaving something just as scarring in its wake. Liesel, and women like her, carried that anomaly through life like a splinter under skin, invisible but impossible to forget. Some would say it was compassion misplaced, others a ripple of humanity in an inhuman time. But perhaps it was simply war showing its rarest face. When memory becomes history, and history shrinks to footnotes, what remains is the feeling, a hand resting too gently, a towel too clean, a silence too kind. And in that impossible tenderness, Camp Ashford lingers, uneasy, unclaimed, a testament not to what war inevitably forces, but to what it might, in rare corners of dusk and doubt, allow to endure. Perhaps that is what makes Camp Ashford's story so heavy, its defiance not of enemy lines, but of emotional logic. It wasn't supposed to be remembered because it wasn't supposed to matter, yet it does, not from books or medals, but from the quiet recollections that survive in the warm breath of a towel or a dream of Appalachian wind. The real war stories are not always gunfire and flags. Sometimes they are a girl standing beneath pine trees, unsure whether to feel safe or ashamed. Liesel's story was not singular. It was one thread in a tapestry too delicate to frame, a memory not celebrated, but carried fragile, uncanny, alive. And though decades have passed, Camp Ashford remains a soft bruise in the collective soul of conflict, untouched by glory, unsimplified by time. It offers no answers, just a touch, a question, a moment when war forgot to be cruel, and what could be more unforgettable than that? And so, the final image lingers, not a battlefield, not a treaty, but a young woman in borrowed clothes stepping into warm water she never believed she'd be allowed to touch. The steam, the scent, the silence, all reminders that not every war wound is visible, and not every reckoning loud. Camp Ashford slipped through cracks in the official record, but in the fragile, flickering spaces where memory breathes, it remains untouched, not for its victories, but for its dissonance, for the stunning betrayal of expectations that proved, even momentarily, mercy could still matter. That legacy, unrecorded yet unforgettable, drifts through time like fog over the Appalachian hills, unclaimed, unexplained, but entirely, deeply true. So if you visit that ridgeline in West Virginia, where crickets still pulse through the dusk and the wind still carries secrets no history book can hold, you won't find a sign. No marker, no pillar, no dates inscribed in granite. But if you step quietly, and listen even more quietly, you might feel something beneath your feet. Not ghosts exactly, but impressions. A memory put down by those young women not in ink or marble, but in breath, in pause, in the hush they knew too well. The war moved on. The world moved on. But in that square of forest once called Camp Ashford, the rules didn't hold. And for a time, mercy took shape in soap, in steam, in folded towels, not because it was strategic, but because it was human. That, in the end, is all that remains. Kindness given when no one asked for it, and remembered, long after everything else was gone. Time will pass and names will be lost, but Camp Ashford will continue to exist in spaces history rarely visits, in the eyes of a grandchild who asks why her grandmother flinches at praise, in the quiet moment when a folded towel carries more weight than a medal. It will live in the breath between questions and in memories that cannot be shelved, because they were never spoken aloud. No textbook will teach it, no monument will declare it. But still, it belongs not to glory, not to shame, but to the strange, sacred space where people who should have inflicted pain instead chose light, a gesture without fanfare, a kindness without explanation. And perhaps that is its truest legacy, that even amid the machinery of destruction, mercy found a way to exist, not loud, not lasting, but enough to be remembered, enough to make the world, if only for a moment, feel less like war and more like hope. And that, perhaps, is where Camp Ashford's memory still lingers, not in stones or banners, but in the invisible weight carried by those who knew its shape, in the gentle flinch at unexpected kindness, in the way warm water can make someone cry, in the silence between praised conduct and private doubt. War often leaves behind ruin. Ashford left a riddle, one that will never quite solve itself, only circle and echo through generations who inherit its questions. Maybe history will lose the name, maybe the town will forget the road, but somewhere, on a quiet morning, someone will fold a towel, pause, and remember something they were never told. And in that pause, brief, unspeakable, sacred, Camp Ashford endures, not as a chapter, but as a breath, not as a triumph, but as a whisper across time, reminding us that even in war, the gentlest acts leave the deepest marks. And maybe that is all history ever truly requires, not endless volumes or parades, but moments that defy the brutal logic of their time. Camp Ashford asked nothing and offered little, yet it lingers because it inverted something essential. It reminds us that even in a world organized around suffering, there are places, however brief, however hidden, where expectation breaks and something softer takes its place. Liesel never returned to speak of it publicly, and most names faded, gentle as mist. But the memory persisted, not in grand declarations, but in quiet rituals, warm water drawn at dusk, towels folded with reverence, the space between punishment and forgiveness held open by choice. That space, thin as it was, mattered, still matters, for in that narrow fold of time and place, war faltered just long enough for humanity to slip through, and that, however small, is worth remembering, because that moment, that pause, changed everything. Because in the end, Camp Ashford was never meant to become a story, and yet it did, not because of what was done, but how it felt. A place built for containment that instead became a testament to the disquieting power of gentleness. When the rules of vengeance whispered brutality, Ashford replied with steam, linens, and quiet civility. That choice, simple and strange, remains its most enduring echo. It was never about absolving the past, nor rewriting the war. It was about proving, even for a moment, that another response was possible. And perhaps that's how history endures best, not as declared fact, but as a trace. A girl's breath caught in steam, a towel folded in silence, a name not famous, but remembered. The story ends where it began, a gate opening, an expectation undone, not with closure, but with questions. Camp Ashford isn't about what happened, it's about what didn't. And that, perhaps, is the deeper scar. So let that be how we remember Camp Ashford, not as a place of judgment, but as a pause in the unfolding violence, quiet and dissonant, not written in bold facts or carved into stone, but felt in the nerve endings of those who passed through it. A girl expecting punishment and receiving soap, a silence not born of fear but of disbelief. These are the fragments that outlive time. Liesel's story, and those like hers, teach us that history is not only shaped by what nations decree, but also by the fragile, human things that refuse to disappear. In the end, Camp Ashford cannot be held in a monument or measured in maps. It exists in the hearts of those who remember being seen when they expected to vanish. And maybe that's the kind of memory that matters most, the one that persists, not because it was loud, but because, in a world gone mad, it dared to be kind. And now, the final silence, not the silence of omission, but of completion. Camp Ashford holds no more bricks to reveal, no more letters to unfold. Its walls, its moments, even its contradictions have been spoken. What remains is the breath that follows, the thin air left behind by a story whispered too long in the shadow of grander tales. But even in this soft ending, something endures, the echo of unexpected mercy, the memory of hands extended where none were owed, and the quiet, lingering truth that sometimes history is shaped not by force, but by restraint. So let this be the last note, not a crescendo, but a held, quiet chord, the kind that stays in the ear long after the music ends. For in that gentle hum, Camp Ashford still lives, not as a place, but as a question to be carried. A question without an answer, but not without meaning.